The gunshot that ended Nathaniel Carson's life echoed across the dusty plains of Trinity Creek, Texas. But it was the accusation that followed that truly shattered Nora Cassidy's world. Standing in her doorway, the 23-year-old schoolteacher stared in disbelief at Sheriff Douglas Jenkins and his two deputies, their expressions hard as the handcuffs they intended to place around her wrists. "Miss Cassidy, you're under arrest for harboring the outlaw who murdered Nathaniel Carson," Sheriff Jenkins announced, his voice carrying across the porch where several townspeople had gathered to witness her humiliation. "I've done no such thing," Nora protested, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders despite the warm May evening in 1878. Her honey-colored hair fell loose around her shoulders, having been disturbed when the lawman pounded on her door. "I've harbored no outlaws." "Witnesses say differently, madam," Deputy Wilson added, stepping forward with the handcuffs. "Several people saw a man coming and going from your property these past 2 weeks, same man who was seen fleeing the scene of Carson's murder yesterday." Nora's heart hammered in her chest. Yes, there had been a man, but surely he couldn't be. "This is absurd," she insisted, though her voice trembled. "The judge arrives from Austin next week," Sheriff Jenkins said, nodding to his deputy to proceed with the arrest. "Until then, you'll be staying in our jail." As the cold metal closed around her wrists, Nora searched the faces of the townspeople she'd served as schoolteacher for the past 2 years. Most looked away. Some whispered behind their hands, and a few those who had never approved of a young, unmarried woman living alone on the edge of town nodded with satisfaction. "I'm innocent," she said, but her words fell on deaf ears as she was led to the waiting wagon that would take her to the jailhouse. What none of them knew was that 30 miles away, a dust-covered cowboy named Samuel Vaughn was riding hard toward Trinity Creek, unaware that the woman who had saved his life was now paying the price for his salvation. The journey to town was humiliating. Nora sat stiffly in the wagon bed, hands bound before her, as they rolled down the main street of Trinity Creek. Every face she'd come to know in her 2 years of teaching turned to watch her past mothers pulling their children closer. Men removing their hats in either respect or judgment, she couldn't tell which. The jailhouse was a squat, stone building at the end of the street. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with the scent of old tobacco, sweat, and desperation. "This way, Miss Cassidy," Sheriff Jenkins said, guiding her to the smaller of the 2 cells. "It's not fitting for a lady to be here, but the law's the law." "Sheriff, please," Nora said, her voice low so the curious onlookers peering through the windows couldn't hear. "You've known me since I arrived in Trinity Creek. Do you honestly believe I would harbor a killer?" The lawman's weathered face showed a flicker of doubt before hardening again. "What I believe doesn't matter. 3 witnesses saw a stranger at your place. Carson is dead, and that stranger was seen leaving town covered in blood." "That doesn't mean, and," Jenkins continued, "Carson's pocket watch was found half buried near your garden. How do you explain that?" Nora felt the blood drain from her face. She hadn't known about the watch. The cell door clanged shut, and Sheriff Jenkins turned the key with a heavy finality. "The circuit judge will be here in a week," he said. "I suggest you think about telling the truth before then." "Harboring is bad, Miss Cassidy, but if you were an accomplice to murder." He shook his head and walked away. Left alone, Nora sank onto the thin mattress that covered the cell's narrow cot. How had everything gone so wrong? Just 2 weeks ago, her life had been perfectly ordinary. Now she faced accusations that could see her hanged. She closed her eyes, remembering the night that had set everything in motion. It had been raining, a rare spring downpour that turned the dirt roads to mud and sent creatures scurrying for shelter. Nora had been reading by lamplight when she heard the thud against her porch. Opening the door, she'd found him a man collapsed on her steps, bleeding from a wound in his side, his clothes torn and muddy. Without thinking, she had dragged him inside and tended his injury, a deep knife wound that looked deliberate rather than accidental. When he'd finally regained consciousness, He'd told her his name was Samuel Vaughn, that he'd been attacked by thieves on the road, and that he was a cattle driver passing through to join a herd headed north. For 5 days, she'd nursed him back to health in her small home. He'd been courteous, grateful, and had kept to the back room during the day to avoid raising questions from any visitors. They'd talked for hours by lamplight about books, about her students, about the places he'd seen in his travels. Not once had she suspected he might be an outlaw or a killer. On the 5th night, he'd announced he was well enough to leave, that he'd imposed on her hospitality long enough. He'd promised to repay her kindness someday and had ridden off before dawn. That had been 3 days ago, the day before Nathaniel Carson was found dead behind the saloon with a bullet in his chest. Now, sitting in that cell with the whispers of the townspeople still ringing in her ears, Nora wondered if she'd been a fool. Had she harbored a murderer? Had the man she'd cared for, whose blue eyes had looked at her with such gratitude and something more, killed a man and left her to face the consequences? No, she whispered to herself. There must be another explanation. But as night fell and the jailhouse grew quiet, doubt crept in with the darkness. Samuel Vaughn was gone, and she was alone with her fate hanging in the balance. The next morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the small barred window of her cell, Nora heard the jailhouse door open. Sheriff Jenkins entered, followed by Mrs. Abernathy, the mayor's wife, who carried a tray of food. "Brought you some breakfast, dear," Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice tense with forced pleasantness. "Can't have you wasting away before the trial." "Thank you," Nora said quietly as the sheriff unlocked the cell long enough for the tray to be set down. "The whole town's talking," Mrs. Abernathy continued, unable to contain her curiosity. "They're saying the man was in your house for days. Is it true?" "Martha," Sheriff Jenkins warned, "this isn't the time for gossip." "It's not gossip to want the truth," the older woman insisted. She turned back to Nora. "Was he your beau? Is that why you hid him?" "I didn't hide anyone," Nora replied, her patience wearing thin despite her precarious situation. "And I have nothing more to say until the judge arrives." Mrs. Abernathy sniffed disapprovingly. "Well, I never. To think we trusted you with our children." After they left, Nora picked at the food without appetite. The news of her arrest would have spread to the outlying farms by now. Her students would know. What would they think of their teacher? Would they believe she could do such a thing? The day passed slowly, marked only by the changing light through the window and occasional visitors to the jailhouse, most coming on invented errands just to get a look at her. By late afternoon, Nora's despair had hardened into resolution. She would not break down. She would not confess to something she hadn't done. Someone knew the truth, and until then, she would endure. As dusk settled over Trinity Creek, the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the quiet. Sheriff Jenkins, who had been dozing at his desk, stood up and moved to the window. "Rider coming in fast," he muttered, reaching for his gun belt. The hoofbeats grew louder until they stopped just outside. The door burst open, and a tall figure stood silhouetted against the fading light. Dust covered his clothes, and his dark hair was windswept from hard riding. "Samuel," Nora whispered, rising to her feet. Samuel Vaughn stepped into the jailhouse, his blue eyes immediately finding Nora behind the bars. Relief and anguish crossed his face in equal measure before he turned to the sheriff. "I understand you're holding Miss Cassidy for harboring an outlaw," he said, his voice deep and steady despite what must have been an exhausting ride. Sheriff Jenkins eyed him suspiciously. "That's right." "And who might you be?" Samuel removed his hat, revealing a handsome face weathered by sun and wind. "My name is Samuel Vaughn. I'm the man she's accused of harboring." He placed his hands on the desk, palms down. "And I'm here to tell you that Nora Cassidy is innocent." She took in an injured traveler, nothing more. Jenkins's hand moved to his holstered gun. "Are you confessing to being the man who murdered Nathaniel Carson?" "No," Samuel said firmly. "I'm confessing to being the man who stayed at Miss Cassidy's home while recovering from a knife wound." "I didn't kill anyone." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. 3 witnesses saw you leaving town the morning Carson was shot. His watch was found near Miss Cassidy's property. I left town at dawn, Samuel agreed, but Carson was killed after sundown, according to what I've heard. I was 30 miles away by then. So you say, Jenkins replied skeptically. Why should I believe you? Samuel's expression hardened. Because I can prove where I was. I reached the Double R Ranch before noon that day and spent the afternoon helping with a difficult calving. Foreman there knows me. I worked that ranch 2 seasons back. He'll vouch for my whereabouts. Samuel, Nora called from her cell, unable to stay silent any longer. You didn't have to come back. He turned to her, his expression softening. Yes, I did. I couldn't let you suffer for my sake. Looking back at the sheriff, he added, whatever evidence you have against her is circumstantial at best. The real killer is still out there. Jenkins frowned, considering this new information. Even if what you say is true, harboring a fugitive is still a crime. But I wasn't a fugitive when she took me in, Samuel insisted. I was injured, nothing more. Check with the sheriff in Meridian County. There are no warrants for my arrest. I'm a cattle driver, not an outlaw. The confrontation was interrupted by a commotion outside. The door opened again, and Deputy Wilson entered with a man in tow. Emmett Dawson, the blacksmith's apprentice. Sheriff, the deputy said urgently, you need to hear what Dawson has to say. The young apprentice twisted his cap in his hands, looking nervously between the sheriff and Samuel. I need to tell the truth, he stammered, about what I saw the night Mr. Carson died. For the next several minutes, the jailhouse was silent except for Emmett's voice, as he recounted witnessing an argument between Nathaniel Carson and another man behind the saloon, not Samuel, but the cattle baron's son, Victor Pierce. They were fighting about money, Emmett explained. Mr. Carson said he was going to tell everyone that young Pierce had been skimming from the cattle sales. Pierce pulled a gun. I was too scared to say anything after. He hung his head in shame. Then, when everyone started saying it was the stranger staying at Miss Cassidy's, I was afraid of what the Pierces would do if I spoke up. Sheriff Jenkins's face darkened. And you decided to come forward now because Miss Cassidy doesn't deserve this, Emmett said, finding his courage. She taught my little sister to read when everyone else said she was too slow. It ain't right, her being in there while Pierce walks free. The sheriff sighed heavily, removing his hat to run a hand through his graying hair. Wilson, go find Judge Parker. He's staying at the hotel. We need to sort this mess out properly. He turned to Samuel. You're not leaving town until we verify your story. Wouldn't dream of it, Samuel replied, his eyes drifting back to Nora. As the deputy left, the sheriff reluctantly unlocked Nora's cell. You can wait in my office, Miss Cassidy. This isn't over, but I won't keep you locked up with what we've just heard. The next hour was a whirlwind of activity as Judge Parker was summoned. Statements were taken, and a rider was dispatched to the Double R Ranch to verify Samuel's alibi. Through it all, Nora sat quietly in the sheriff's chair, still processing the sudden turn of events and the return of the man who had occupied her thoughts since his departure. Eventually, the jailhouse emptied except for Samuel, who had been permitted to stay under the supervision of Deputy Wilson. As the deputy stepped outside to smoke, Samuel moved to Nora's side. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I never imagined this would happen. Nora looked up at him, a mix of emotions churning within her. Why did you come back? You were free and clear. Samuel's eyes, blue as the Texas sky, held her steadily. I heard about your arrest in the next town over. Some travelers were discussing it at the saloon how the schoolteacher in Trinity Creek was jailed for harboring a murderer. He shook his head. I couldn't let you pay for my presence in your home, even though it meant risking your own freedom. Even then. He hesitated, then added softly, you showed me kindness when I needed it most. How could I do any less for you? Before Nora could respond, the door opened, and Sheriff Jenkins returned with Judge Parker, a stern-faced man with a trim white beard. Miss Cassidy, the judge said, nodding politely. It seems we have a complicated situation here. I understand new evidence has come to light regarding Mr. Carson's murder. Yes, Your Honor, Sheriff Jenkins confirmed. We've sent men to apprehend Victor Pierce for questioning based on Emmett Dawson's testimony. And what of this man? Judge Parker gestured to Samuel. Is he still suspected of involvement? We're waiting on confirmation of his whereabouts during the murder, the sheriff replied. But Dawson was clear that the man he saw with Carson was Pierce, not Vaughn here. The judge turned his attention to Nora, and the charge of harboring an outlaw. That outlaw was me, not her, Samuel interjected firmly. And as I've told the sheriff, I'm no outlaw. I was injured and she provided aid, as any decent person would. There was no harboring of a fugitive because I wasn't one. Judge Parker considered this. If Mr. Vaughn's story checks out, and if there are indeed no warrants for his arrest, then the charge against you, Miss Cassidy, would be without foundation. He stroked his beard thoughtfully. However, propriety must also be considered. A young, unmarried woman allowing a strange man to stay in her home. With all due respect, Your Honor, Nora spoke up, finding her voice at last. Propriety would have had me leave an injured man to die on my doorstep. I chose humanity over propriety, and I would do so again. A hint of admiration flickered in the judge's eyes. Well said, Miss Cassidy. Well said indeed. As night fell fully over Trinity Creek, a tentative peace settled in the jailhouse. Nora remained in the sheriff's office, now with a pot of tea provided by Mrs. Jenkins, who had arrived with apologies and a look of maternal concern. Samuel sat nearby, his presence both comforting and confusing to Nora, who still had so many questions. When confirmation finally arrived from the Double R Ranch late that night, vouching for Samuel's presence there during the time of the murder, Sheriff Jenkins officially released Nora from custody with his own gruff apology. You're free to go home, Miss Cassidy, he said, genuine regret in his voice. I'll have Deputy Wilson escort you. I'll see her home, Samuel offered, standing. The sheriff gave him a measuring look before nodding. See that you do, Mr. Vaughn, and see that you behave as a gentleman should. Outside, the night air was cool and sweet after the stuffiness of the jailhouse. Stars scattered across the vast Texas sky like diamonds on velvet, and the streets of Trinity Creek were quiet save for the distant piano music drifting from the saloon. They walked in silence for several minutes, the tension between them palpable. Finally, as they reached the edge of town, Nora spoke. You never told me why you were really wounded that night. Samuel's stride faltered slightly. No, I didn't. Was it thieves on the road, like you said? He sighed, adjusting his hat. No, it was Victor Pierce. Nora stopped walking, turning to face him. Pierce, the same man who killed Carson, Samuel nodded grimly. I caught him rustling cattle from a neighboring ranch. He attacked me with a knife when I confronted him. I managed to get away on my horse, but I was losing blood. Your house was the first place I came to. Why didn't you tell me the truth? Because Pierce is powerful in these parts, Samuel explained. His father owns half the county. I didn't want to involve you in something dangerous. Nora resumed walking, processing this revelation. So instead you let me believe a lie. I'm sorry for that, he said quietly. It seemed safer at the time. They reached Nora's small house, which sat alone at the end of a winding dirt path, bordered by a neat garden that was her pride and joy. The sight of it, untouched despite her absence, brought a lump to her throat. What will you do now? She asked as they stopped at her front steps. Samuel looked out across the darkened landscape, then back to her. I came back to clear your name. I never expected to find myself entangled in a murder investigation. That doesn't answer my question. A small smile touched his lips. No, it doesn't. He hesitated, then continued. I was heading north to the cattle drives in Montana. Good money up there for experienced hands. I see, Nora said, trying to ignore the disappointment that settled in her chest. Of course he would leave again. Men like Samuel Vaughn never stayed in one place for long. Well, I thank you for coming back to clear my name. That was honorable. She turned to climb her porch steps, but his voice stopped her. Nora. It was the first time he'd called her by her first name, and something in the way he said it made her heart skip. I've been thinking, he continued, that Montana might be too far north. The winters are harsh there. She turned back, unsure where he was going with this. I imagine they would be. The Double R Ranch offered me a permanent position, he said, taking a step closer. Foreman seems to think I have a way with the horses. Hope fluttered in Nora's chest, but she tamped it down. The Double R is a good outfit, from what I hear. It's 30 miles from here, Samuel added, his eyes never leaving hers. Far enough to be respectable, close enough to ride in for Sunday services, or to call on the schoolteacher if she were amenable to visitors. Nora's breath caught. Are you saying you plan to stay in the territory? I'm saying, he replied, removing his hat and closing the distance between them, that for the first time in my life, I've found someone worth staying for, if she'll have me. The air between them seemed to crackle with possibility. Nora knew she should be cautious. This man had entered her life in a whirlwind of danger and deception, had brought her to the brink of ruin, and had then rescued her just as dramatically. Yet there was something in his eyes, something steady and true that belied the tumultuous circumstances of their meeting. I hardly know you, she whispered. I know, he acknowledged, and there's much about me you should learn before anything more is said. But I'd like the chance to court you properly, Nora Cassidy. No more secrets, no more danger, just a man calling on a woman he greatly admires. The honesty in his voice touched her deeply. Despite everything, she found herself nodding. I think I would like that, Samuel Vaughn. His smile, then, was worth all the trouble his appearance had caused her. He reached for her hand, and when she offered it, he pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Until Sunday, then, he said, replacing his hat and backing away. I'll ride in for services. I'll save you a seat, she promised, a smile tugging at her own lips. As Samuel mounted his horse and rode off into the night, Nora stood on her porch, watching until he disappeared from sight. The future suddenly seemed full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Inside her home, everything was as she had left it, her books neatly arranged, her students' papers stacked on the small desk in the corner, her half-finished embroidery waiting in the basket by her chair. Yet something had changed. Something fundamental that had nothing to do with the physical space and everything to do with the woman who inhabited it. For the first time since coming west to take the teaching position in Trinity Creek, Nora felt as though she might have found not just a purpose, but a home. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze. Perfect weather for the first time in Trinity Creek's history that every single resident seemed determined to attend church services. News of Victor Pierce's arrest for the murder of Nathaniel Carson, coupled with the dramatic exoneration of their schoolteacher, had spread like wildfire through the small community. Nora felt every eye on her as she made her way to the white clapboard church at the center of town. She had chosen her best dress, a modest blue calico with white lace at the collar and cuffs, and had arranged her honey-colored hair in a neat chignon beneath her Sunday bonnet. Despite the whispers that followed her, she held her head high. Miss Cassidy. Young Sally Cooper broke away from her parents to run to Nora's side. Are you coming back to teach us tomorrow? Sally, mind your manners, Mrs. Cooper scolded, hurrying after her daughter with an apologetic look to Nora. It's quite all right, Nora assured her with a warm smile. And yes, Sally, I'll be back in the schoolhouse tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock sharp. The child beamed. Good, nobody tells stories like you do. As the Coopers moved on, Mayor Abernathy approached with his wife, whose expression was considerably less pinched than it had been in the jailhouse. Miss Cassidy, the mayor said, doffing his hat. On behalf of the town council, I want to extend our deepest apologies for the unfortunate misunderstanding. Thank you, Mayor, Nora replied graciously. I understand the circumstances were unusual. Most unusual indeed, Mrs. Abernathy added, unable to resist. And speaking of unusual, I hear that handsome cowboy who came to your rescue might be staying in these parts. Is that true?" Before Nora could respond, the church bell began to ring, signaling it was time for services to begin. She excused herself and made her way inside, choosing a seat near the back. As the pews filled around her, she found herself watching the door, wondering if Samuel would keep his word. Just as Reverend Michaels was preparing to begin, the door opened once more and Samuel Vaughn stepped inside. He had cleaned up considerably since she'd last seen him. His dark hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, and his clothes, while simple, were clean and pressed. He paused in the doorway, scanning the congregation until his eyes found hers. The smile that spread across his face at the sight of her sent a warmth flooding through Nora that had nothing to do with the close quarters of the crowded church. She shifted slightly in her pew, making room beside her, and he made his way to her side with murmured apologies to those he passed. "You came," she whispered as he settled next to her. "I said I would," he replied simply. Throughout the service, Nora was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the clean scent of soap that clung to him, the way their shoulders occasionally brushed when they stood for hymns, the deep resonance of his voice as he joined in the singing. It was both distracting and comforting in equal measure. After the service concluded, they lingered on the church steps as the congregation dispersed. Many approached to greet them, some out of genuine goodwill, others clearly driven by curiosity about the man who had ridden into town to save their schoolteacher. "Mr. Vaughn," Sheriff Jenkins said, approaching with his wife on his arm. "I hear you've taken a position at the Double R." "Yes, sir," Samuel confirmed. "Started this week." The sheriff nodded approvingly. "Good outfit, honest people." He cleared his throat. "I want you to know there'll be no trouble from the law if you're planning to visit our town regularly." "I appreciate that, Sheriff. And Miss Cassidy, Mrs." Jenkins added, "I've spoken with the school board. They're unanimous in wanting you to continue as our teacher." "Thank you," Nora said sincerely. "The children mean a great deal to me." As the couple moved on, Samuel turned to Nora. "I brought a picnic if you'd care to join me. There's a nice spot by the creek I passed on my way in." The invitation was innocent enough, but Nora was aware of the watching eyes and wagging tongues that had nearly destroyed her reputation once already. Seeing her hesitation, Samuel added softly, "Mrs. Jenkins already approved the outing. Said she'd be happy to serve as chaperone, but her husband intervened and said we were grown adults who could behave respectably without supervision." Nora couldn't help but laugh. "Did he now?" His exact words were, "For heaven's sake, Martha, let the man court the lady without an audience." "Well, if the sheriff approves," Nora said, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "How can I refuse?" They rode together on Samuel's horse to the spot he had mentioned, a grassy clearing beside Trinity Creek, where wildflowers dotted the banks and cottonwood trees provided dappled shade. Samuel spread a blanket on the ground and produced a surprisingly well-prepared picnic from his saddlebags. "Did you arrange all this yourself?" Nora asked as he laid out bread, cheese, cold chicken, and even a small jar of preserves. "I had some help from the ranch cook," he admitted with a smile. "When I told him I was calling on a lady, he took pity on me." They ate and talked, the initial awkwardness between them gradually melting away as they shared stories of their lives. Samuel told her about growing up in Missouri, losing his parents to fever when he was 16, and making his way west to find work on the cattle ranches. Nora spoke of her childhood in Boston, her decision to become a teacher, and the advertisement seeking an educator for a small Texas town that had brought her to Trinity Creek. "Weren't you afraid?" Samuel asked, leaning back on his elbows as the afternoon sun filtered through the leaves above them. "Coming all this way alone?" "Terrified," Nora admitted. "But sometimes fear is the price of freedom. I didn't want to end up like my mother, married to a man she didn't love because society expected it, living a life that slowly drained her spirit until there was nothing left." Samuel studied her thoughtfully. "You're a brave woman, Nora Cassidy." Not brave, she demurred. Just stubborn. Both, I think. He sat up, picking a wildflower from beside the blanket and twirling it between his fingers. That's why you took me in that night, isn't it? Not just kindness, but courage. Nora considered this. Perhaps, or perhaps just foolishness. Do you regret it? He asked quietly. After everything that happened, she met his gaze steadily. No, I don't. The simple honesty of her answer seemed to touch something deep within him. He reached across the space between them and gently tucked the wildflower behind her ear, his fingers lingering for just a moment against her cheek. I should get you back to town, he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. Before we give the good people of Trinity Creek more to gossip about. The ride back was peaceful, with Nora seated before Samuel on his horse, acutely aware of his arms around her as he held the reins. When they reached her house, he helped her down, his hands strong and sure at her waist. When will I see you again? She asked as they stood facing each other in the fading afternoon light. I have to be at the ranch through Saturday, he replied, but I'll ride in next Sunday for certain. Nora nodded, trying not to show her disappointment at the prospect of a full week without seeing him. I'll look forward to it. Samuel reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his. Nora, I want you to know that I meant what I said. I intend to court you properly, with all the respect you deserve. I believe you, she said softly. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent a thrill racing through her. Until Sunday, then. As she watched him ride away, Nora touched the wildflower still tucked behind her ear and smiled. Life had taken an unexpected turn, but for once, the uncertainty ahead felt more like promise than peril. The following weeks established a pattern that quickly became the highlight of Nora's life. True to his word, Samuel rode into Trinity Creek every Sunday, attended church services beside her, and afterward they would enjoy time together, sometimes picnicking by the creek, other times walking through town or sitting on her porch swing, talking until the sun began to set. Each visit revealed more of the man behind the mysterious stranger who had collapsed on her doorstep that rainy night. She learned that he could play the harmonica, that he had a talent for sketching landscapes, and that he had once dreamed of becoming a surveyor before life had pushed him toward ranch work instead. He was thoughtful and well-read, despite his lack of formal education, borrowing books from Nora and discussing them on his next visit. For his part, Samuel discovered Nora's passion for teaching, her quick wit that she typically kept hidden behind a proper demeanor, and her secret love of adventure stories that she considered not entirely suitable for a schoolteacher. He delighted in bringing her small gifts, a ribbon for her hair, a book of poetry he'd found in Austin, wildflowers gathered along the trail. The town watched their courtship with interest that gradually transformed from scandal-hungry curiosity to genuine goodwill. The sheriff's endorsement carried significant weight, and as weeks passed without incident, even the most suspicious townspeople began to accept Samuel's presence. By midsummer, their Sunday meetings had expanded to include occasional Wednesday evening visits, when Samuel would ride in after work to take Nora to dinner at the hotel restaurant Trinity Creek's only establishment fine enough for proper courting. It was on one such Wednesday in late July, as they walked back to her house under a sky ablaze with stars, that Samuel finally spoke of the future. Nora, he began, his voice unusually serious as they stopped at her garden gate, there's something I need to ask you. Her heart quickened. They had been courting for nearly 3 months now, and while neither had spoken explicitly of long-term intentions, she had begun to hope that his feelings ran as deep as her own. What is it, Samuel? He took both her hands in his expression earnest in the silver moonlight. The foreman at R is retiring at the end of summer. He's recommended me to take his place. Samuel, that's wonderful, Nora exclaimed, genuinely pleased for him. You've certainly earned it. It comes with the foreman's cabin, he continued, a good, solid house with 2 bedrooms and a proper kitchen, far nicer than the bunkhouse I've been staying in. Nora nodded, sensing there was more he wanted to say. "It's too big a house for just one person," he added softly. "Oh." She breathed, hardly daring to hope what might come next. Samuel took a deep breath, then sank to one knee before her, still holding her hands in his. "Nora Cassidy, these past months have been the happiest of my life. I rode into Trinity Creek a wounded drifter with nothing to offer but trouble, and somehow found everything I never knew I was looking for." His voice caught slightly. "I love you, your kindness, your courage, your heart. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears sprang to Nora's eyes, blurring the sight of this good man kneeling before her in the moonlight. "Yes," she whispered, then again more strongly. "Yes, Samuel, I will." The joy that illuminated his face was breathtaking. He rose to his feet, and for the first time since they'd met, he took her in his arms and kissed her a gentle, reverent kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. When they finally broke apart, both flushed and smiling, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I don't have a ring yet," he admitted. "I wanted to ask first, to be sure. I don't need a ring," Nora interrupted, her hands resting on his chest where she could feel his heart beating strong and steady. "Just you, Samuel, that's all I need." The news of their engagement spread through Trinity Creek with remarkable speed. By the time Nora arrived at the schoolhouse the following morning, congratulations were already being offered by parents dropping off their children. "Miss Cassidy is getting married," Sally Cooper announced to anyone who would listen. "Is Mr. Vaughn going to live in your house now, Miss Cassidy? Will you still be our teacher?" "Sally," Nora admonished gently, though she couldn't help but smile at the child's enthusiasm. "Mr. Vaughn and I won't be married until after harvest time. And yes, I will continue teaching at least until the school board finds a suitable replacement." This last part brought a chorus of protests from her students, who couldn't imagine their school without Miss Cassidy. Nora calmed them with promises that any change was still months away, and that she would help choose a teacher who loved books and stories just as much as she did. The remainder of July and August passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Samuel rode into town more frequently, sometimes staying overnight at the hotel so he could help with arrangements for their future. They decided the wedding would take place in early October, after the cattle drives were complete and the ranch work had slowed for winter. On a warm September afternoon, Samuel arrived unexpectedly at the schoolhouse just as Nora was dismissing her students for the day. The children swarmed around him, having grown fond of their teacher's fiancé during his increasingly frequent visits. "Mr. Vaughn, did you bring your horse?" Young Thomas Wilson asked eagerly. "Can I pet him again?" "He's tied up outside," Samuel answered with a grin. "Just don't feed him any more peppermints. Last time he followed you around like a puppy for an hour." As the children raced outside, Samuel approached Nora's desk, his expression a mix of excitement and nervousness that immediately piqued her curiosity. "This is a pleasant surprise," she said, rising to greet him. "I wasn't expecting you until Saturday." "I couldn't wait," he replied, reaching into his coat pocket. "I've been carrying this around for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment." He produced a small velvet pouch and emptied its contents into his palm, a delicate gold ring set with a small pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "It was my mother's," he explained softly. "I've kept it all these years, hoping someday I'd find someone worthy of wearing it." Nora's breath caught as he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. "Samuel, it's beautiful." "Like its new owner," he said, brushing a kiss against her forehead. "But that's not the only reason I came early." He led her outside to where his horse stood patiently beside a small wagon. In the wagon bed was a trunk, which she recognized from her bedroom. "Samuel Vaughn, what have you done?" she asked, bewildered. "Something impulsive," he admitted with a sheepish smile. "I spoke with Reverend Michaels this morning. He's waiting for us at the church with Sheriff and Mrs. Jenkins as witnesses." Nora stared at him in disbelief. "You want to get married today? Now. Right now," he confirmed. "I've finished the foreman's cabin, Nora. Everything's ready, and I realized I don't want to wait another day to make you my wife." His confidence faltered slightly at her stunned expression. "Unless you'd rather stick to our original plan. I know ladies usually want a proper wedding with—" Nora silenced him with a kiss, throwing her arms around his neck with such enthusiasm that several lingering students giggled behind their hands. "I take it that's a yes?" Samuel asked when she finally released him, looking slightly dazed but undeniably pleased. "Yes," she laughed, "though I'm hardly dressed for a wedding." She gestured to her plain work dress, smudged with chalk dust from the day's lessons. "You're perfect," he insisted. "But I did bring this, just in case." He reached into the wagon and pulled out a paper-wrapped package. "Mrs. Jenkins helped me choose it in Austin last week." Inside was a simple but elegant white dress with lace at the collar and a matching ribbon for her hair. It wasn't the elaborate wedding gown she might have dreamed of as a young girl, but as she held it against herself, Nora knew it was exactly right for the woman she had become, practical but beautiful, like the life they would build together. An hour later, in the small white church where they had first sat side by side, Nora Cassidy became Nora Vaughn in a ceremony witnessed by the sheriff and his wife, Reverend Michaels. And to her surprise and delight, a church full of her students and their parents, secretly summoned by Mrs. Jenkins while Nora changed into her wedding dress. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Michaels declared, beaming at the couple before him. "Mr. Vaughn, you may kiss your bride." As Samuel's lips met hers, sealing their vows with a kiss that promised both passion and tenderness, Nora felt a sense of homecoming deeper than any she had ever known. The path that had led her to this moment had been unexpected, and at times frightening, but standing here in the circle of her husband's arms, surrounded by the community that had become her family, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The journey to their new home at the Double R Ranch was a joyous one, with the wagon decorated with ribbons and flowers by Nora's students. Samuel drove with Nora beside him, her hand resting comfortably in his, their new gold wedding bands catching the late afternoon sunlight. "Are you happy, Mrs. Vaughn?" Samuel asked, his voice rich with emotion as he used her new name for the first time outside the church. "Completely," she replied, squeezing his hand. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible." He glanced at her, his blue eyes warm with love. "I still can't believe you're actually my wife." "Believe it," Nora said, leaning against his shoulder. "You're stuck with me now, Cowboy." The Double R Ranch sprawled across several thousand acres of prime Texas grazing land, with the main house and outbuildings clustered near the eastern boundary. As they approached, Nora could see cowboys working in the distance, moving cattle from one pasture to another in the golden light of sunset. Samuel guided the wagon past the main house, an impressive two-story structure that belonged to the ranch owner, and the bunkhouse, where he had lived until recently. They continued down a well-worn path that curved around a stand of cottonwood trees, finally revealing a small but sturdy cabin nestled at the edge of a meadow. "There it is," Samuel said, a note of pride in his voice. "Our home." The foreman's cabin was indeed everything he had described: a solid structure with a generous porch wrapped around two sides, windows gleaming with fresh glass, and a curl of smoke rising from the stone chimney. "You said it was ready, but—" Nora trailed off, taking in the flower boxes beneath the windows, filled with late-blooming wildflowers, and the porch swing hanging from sturdy chains. "I had some help," Samuel admitted as he brought the wagon to a stop. The ranch hands pitched in. "They were almost as excited about this marriage as I was." Before she could respond, the cabin door opened, and an older woman with silver-streaked hair emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "Right on time," she called cheerfully. "I was beginning to worry the Reverend had changed his mind." "Mrs. Thornton," Samuel explained to Nora, the ranch owner's housekeeper. "She insisted on helping prepare the cabin. Couldn't have the new foreman's wife arriving to a cold hearth and an empty pantry, could I?" Mrs. Thornton said, coming to greet them. "Welcome to Double R, Mrs. Vaughn. We're mighty pleased to have a schoolteacher among us. The hands with children have been beside themselves with excitement." "There are children here?" Nora asked, pleasantly surprised. "5 of our married cowboys have families living in cabins along the creek," Mrs. Thornton explained. "Plus the owner's granddaughters who visit in the summers. They've been making do with lessons from whoever has the time but a proper teacher." She clasped her hands together. "It's a blessing, truly." Samuel helped Nora down from the wagon, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms. "Mrs. Thornton, if you'll excuse us," he said, carrying Nora toward the porch. "I believe it's tradition for a man to carry his bride over the threshold." The older woman waved them on with a knowing smile. "Everything's ready inside. I'll see to your horse and send some of the boys for the wagon later." The inside of the cabin exceeded all of Nora's expectations. The main room was warm and inviting, with a stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and bookshelves already partially filled with Samuel's modest collection of books. A kitchen area occupied one corner, with a cast iron stove, wooden cabinets, and a table set for 2 with a vase of wildflowers at its center. "Samuel, it's wonderful," Nora breathed as he set her gently on her feet. "I wanted it to be perfect for you," he said, watching her face anxiously as she explored their new home. "The bedroom is through there, and there's a smaller room that could be a nursery someday, or a study for your lessons if you decide to teach the ranch children." Nora turned to him, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who had thought of everything, who had created not just a house but a home for their future together. "It is perfect," she assured him, walking back into his waiting arms. "Absolutely perfect." As night fell over the ranch, they shared their first meal as husband and wife at their own table, a hearty stew Mrs. Thornton had left warming on the stove, with fresh bread and apple pie for dessert. They talked and laughed, making plans for their future and marveling at how much had changed since that rainy night when fate had brought a wounded stranger to Nora's door. Later, as moonlight spilled through the bedroom window, Samuel took his wife in his arms with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. Their love, born in danger and nurtured through adversity, blossomed fully in the safety of their marriage bed, each touch and whispered endearment a promise of the life they would build together. In the quiet aftermath, as they lay entwined beneath the patchwork quilt that had been a wedding gift from the Jenkins family, Nora traced the scar on Samuel's side, the wound that had brought him to her. "Do you ever think about how different our lives would be if you hadn't been injured that night?" she asked softly. "If you had never come to my door," Samuel caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I've thought about it often," he admitted. "I lost blood, my horse, nearly my life, but I found you. I'd say that was more than a fair trade." Nora smiled in the darkness. "When I took you in, I never imagined I was letting my future husband bleed all over my best rug. And when I woke up to find an angel tending my wounds, I never dreamed she'd one day bear my name." He pulled her closer, his voice growing serious. "I love you, Nora Vaughn, more than I have words to express." "Then show me," she whispered, turning in his arms to find his lips with hers. "We have all night, and all our tomorrows." And so began their life together, a schoolteacher and a cowboy whose paths had crossed in the most unexpected of ways, bound together by love, honor, and the promise of a future neither had dared to imagine before finding the other. The seasons turned, and life at Double R Ranch settled into a rhythm that suited the newlyweds perfectly. Samuel thrived in his role as foreman, earning the respect of the ranch hands through his fair treatment and willingness to work alongside them. Nora, meanwhile, established a small school for the ranch children, teaching in a converted storage building near the main house 3 mornings a week, while continuing her position at the Trinity Creek schoolhouse the other days. By the spring of 1879, their happiness was made complete when Nora discovered she was expecting their first child. Samuel's reaction to the news, dropping to his knees to press his ear against her still flat stomach. Tears shimmering in his blue eyes was something Nora knew she would treasure forever. "Hello in there, little one," he had whispered. "I'm your pa, and I can't wait to meet you." Their daughter, Elizabeth Rose Vaughn, arrived on a crisp November morning just as the sun was breaking over the eastern horizon. She had her mother's honey-colored hair and her father's blue eyes, and from the moment she drew her first breath, she was the center of their world. Life wasn't without its challenges. The drought of 1880 tested the ranch severely, with Samuel working from dawn until well past dusk to ensure the cattle had access to what little water remained. Winter blizzards sometimes isolated them for weeks at a time, and the everyday hardships of frontier life required strength and resilience from both of them. Yet through it all, their love only deepened. Each obstacle overcome, each joy shared, each quiet evening spent together on their porch swing watching the sunset bound them more tightly to one another. They added to their family a son, James, born in 1881, followed by another daughter, Margaret, in 1883. On a warm evening in the spring of 1884, nearly 6 years after they had first met, Nora and Samuel sat together on their porch swing, watching their children play in the meadow before the house. Elizabeth, now 4.5, was showing her younger brother how to make daisy chains, while baby Margaret napped in a cradle beside them. "I received a letter from Sheriff Jenkins today," Nora said, leaning comfortably against her husband's side. "Victor Pierce is being released from prison." Samuel's arm tightened slightly around her shoulders. "After all this time? Apparently he's served his sentence," Nora replied. "The sheriff wanted to warn us just in case." They sat in thoughtful silence for a moment, considering the man whose actions had so dramatically altered the course of their lives. Victor Pierce's arrest and subsequent conviction for the murder of Nathaniel Carson had been a sensation in Trinity Creek. His influential father had hired expensive lawyers from Austin, but Emmett Dawson's testimony, combined with other evidence uncovered during the investigation, had been damning. "Do you think he'll cause trouble?" Nora asked, voicing the concern that lingered between them. Samuel shook his head. His father lost everything defending him: the ranch, their reputation, their standing in the community. "From what I heard, the old man died broken and penniless 2 years ago. Victor has nothing to gain by stirring up the past." Nora nodded, comforted by his certainty. "It's strange to think how differently things might have turned out. If you hadn't confronted him about the rustling, if he hadn't attacked you, if I hadn't been home that night. If I hadn't come back to clear your name," Samuel added softly. "Yes," she smiled up at him. "That was quite gallant of you, Mr. Vaughn." "Nothing gallant about it, Mrs. Vaughn," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Just a man who couldn't bear the thought of an innocent woman, suffering for his sake, especially a woman who had shown him more kindness in 5 days than he'd known in years of wandering." Elizabeth's laughter drifted to them from the meadow, where she had crowned her brother with a circle of daisies, much to the little boy's mixed delight and dismay. "We've been blessed, haven't we?" Nora murmured, watching their children. "Despite everything, or perhaps because of it." Samuel followed her gaze, his expression softening with love and pride. "More blessed than I ever dreamed possible." He took her hand, running his thumb over the wedding ring that hadn't left her finger in nearly 6 years. "Do you remember what the Reverend said at our wedding? That love born in adversity often proves the strongest and most enduring." "I remember," Nora said, turning her face up to his. "He was right." Samuel bent to kiss her, a tender gesture as familiar and essential as breathing after years of marriage, yet still capable of sending a thrill through her heart. "Mama, Papa, look what we made." Elizabeth called, running toward the porch with her brother toddling behind, both children adorned with garlands of spring flowers. As they welcomed their children onto the porch, showering them with praise and laughter, Nora caught her husband's eye over their daughter's head. The love she saw reflected there steady, unwavering, and as boundless as the Texas sky, was all the confirmation she needed that their story, begun in danger and doubt, had grown into something beautiful and lasting. Later that night, with their children tucked safely in bed and the ranch quiet under a canopy of stars, Samuel and Nora stood together at the edge of their porch, his arms wrapped around her from behind as they gazed out at the land that had become their home. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is our life," Nora confessed, leaning back against his solid warmth. "That frightened, rain-soaked stranger on my doorstep, the jail cell, the trial, it all seems like something from a novel." "The best stories are the ones you never see coming," Samuel said, his breath warm against her hair. "And ours is just beginning, my love, just beginning." As they turned back toward the welcoming light of their home, hand in hand as they had been since that pivotal moment in the Trinity Creek jailhouse, both knew with absolute certainty that whatever chapters remained to be written in their story, they would face them together, the schoolteacher and the cowboy whose destinies had become irrevocably intertwined on a stormy night in the wild Texas frontier. For in a land where justice was often swift and merciless, where a single accusation could destroy a life, they had found something rare and precious, a love strong enough to withstand both the harsh realities of the West and the test of time itself. A love that had transformed two solitary souls into a family, and a simple cabin into the heart of a home that would shelter generations of Vaughns to come. And in the years that followed, when their children asked how their parents had met, Samuel would always begin the tale the same way. "Your mother was once accused of harboring an outlaw, and I stood before the judge and testified that outlaw was me, not her." Then he would look at Nora with a smile that held all the love and gratitude of a man who had found his way home at last, and add, "And that, my darlings, was the beginning of the greatest adventure of our lives."